just want to say thank you, Patricia. Thank you for joining us and being willing to speak to us. We're really excited. She has some wonderful credits. She sounds like a wonderful person. I'm excited. So Patricia Knight Meyer is an adoptee who reunited with both birth parents 13 years ago. Patricia possesses a journalism degree from the University of Texas and has been published in numerous newspapers and magazines. And she dedicates her life to inspiring creativity in others. She's very active in adoption and writing communities. She writes about her reunion experience at myadoptedlife.com and is the administrator for the Adoption Constellation Church and Reunion Facebook support group. Patricia is a member of the National Association of Memoir Writers, Adoption Knowledge Affiliates, and the Writers League of Texas. Patricia's reunion story has been covered by the Huffington Post, the Austin American Statesman, and the WHIV radio in New Orleans. Patricia and her birth father presented at AKA in 2013, and we're happy she's back. She spoke at the National Association of Adoptees and Parents NAAP Fall Retreat in September in 2023. So September of 2023. That's wonderful. She's bouncing between the Texas Hill Country and New Orleans. She works as a book publicist and content strategist, attending an annual writing retreat in Costa Rica. It's awesome. A baby scoop era Black market adoptee, Patricia was sold along a curb outside a Texas hospital and grew up with no legal identity, date of birth, finalized adoption, or court-appointed guardian. At 40, she's reunited now with both biological parents, and at 53, finished a memoir sharing how she uncovered the dirty deal that stole her true identity. So thank you, and we'll pass it over to Patricia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction, though. Listening to it, I was like, oh boy, that's a little long. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm hoping that everybody got a chance to hear Susan's keynote this morning. It was fantastic. And I hope that, I know she did some writing exercises and some that really got a lot of people's creative juices flowing. So I hope that we get to, I get
Patricia, you're muted, Patricia.
Am I unmuted? Am I muted?
You're muted now. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to push mute all and I did it wrong. So that's on me. I'm so sorry. Please continue.
Okay. Well, did you hear everything or should I just kind of start over?
Yeah, if you would like, yes. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay. It's no problems. I was just going to say, you know, how happy I am to be here, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm just wowed to get to talk to these folks here all at AKA, because AKA is the first organization that sort of embraced me and helped me get through my journey. And so to be speaking here today is just wonderful. Also, today is the second anniversary of losing my birth father. And as you mentioned, 11 years ago, he and I spoke at this exact conference. It was in the very first year of our reunion. So I know he'd be really happy to see me here doing this today, and AKA held a huge place in his heart as well. Also, I hope that everybody that's here got to hear Susan's keynote this morning, because she included some writing exercises today that I think definitely got my creative juices flowing. I'm sure that it probably got you guys too. And we're just going to pick up where she left off with that. I want to start by saying that I don't have an MFA and I'm not a therapist, and my book hasn't even been published yet. Mainly that's because I'm holding out hope for an agent. I'm going to give it a little bit longer and seeing how it goes. I may self-publish, but I'm still undecided there. As you noted, I'm a black market baby. I was sold for $30,000 on a curb in 1969. I solved my mystery about how and why that happened. I met my birth parents, and in doing all of that, I realized I had a story to tell, and so I wrote it. I'm also an adoptee who made every mistake a first-time memoirist can make, and I spent about twice as long getting to my final draft than was really needed because I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I'm eager to share some of those hard-won lessons with you guys here today. As you heard, I have a degree in journalism. I've worked as a writer most of my life, but ultimately I was way too overly confident in my ability to tell a good story. And shamefully, it didn't even occur to me to study the form of memoir before I started writing it. So therefore, I wrote with no roadmap, no story structure whatsoever. And I learned a lot along the way, but unfortunately, I learned it the hard way. So I'm going to say to you what I would say to this young woman in this picture here. Finding your birth parents, turning 40, and knowing how to write does not make you a memoirist. So study the basics of novel writing before you begin. And I say novel because your memoir needs to read like a page turner. It needs to use all the same great devices that a good novel does. And to remember that you're not married to your first or even your fifth draft, but if you just start out knowing a few of the basics, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. And by creating a framework, you're going to keep your story on track, and it's going to make the process so much easier. I share this picture here because I want to emphasize how important this is. Maybe it's because I'm such a perfectionist, but I ended up with 15 drafts and I wrote 120,000 words, 40,000 of which I struck, because your average first memoir is going to be around 80,000. Now, the good news is I took those other 40 and I'm already have plans for a different book that I'm going to use. So it never hurts to write too much as long as you figure out, how you can use it later. But it was tedious trying to tease out from all of those words what parts were going to stay in the book. My point is I took the long road, and you don't have to. So while time isn't going to allow me to dive too deep into all the elements of memoir writing, I do want to look at how you find the bones of your story. And I think that's a really great place to start from in a talk like this. But first, I want to look at why we in the constellation are drawn to writing memoir. Now, of course, we write our stories because we want to share them with the world, but also when you're writing a memoir, you're going through a process of self-discovery. And a lot of what we do is forming our identity. We're working on identity formation throughout our lives, particularly those people in the constellation. We're coping with trauma, and we're coping with grief, and we're healing, and we're trying to accept the things that happen to us in our life. And writing is really a wonderful way to achieve all of these four things. Additionally, a lot of the people in our community who have written a memoir, they use them as a form of advocacy, and they drive awareness, and they unite our voices, and they can be used as a tool for social change. Now, I want to share a quote that I love. It says, "Tell the story of the mountain you climbed. Your words could become a page in someone else's survival guide." These are the words of Morgan Harper Nichols, who I really didn't even know who this person was, so I Googled her. And she is an autistic mixed media artist from Atlanta. She has more than 1 million followers on social media. And she's the author of a collection of poetry called All Along You Were Blooming. And I just love that title. I don't believe she has any connection to the constellation, but she's definitely a person worth checking out, like on a side note. Now, I will say that this picture I took at the Untangling Our Roots conference. This is a panel of authors that was there, many of whom I've become friends with. And I believe they would all say that memoir helps heal us both as we write and as we share our stories. And even if a single soul never reads my book, I would write it again in a heartbeat because I healed so much in the process. And as we write our stories, what our readers gain is empathy and understanding and expanded perspectives of our experience. You know, all these memoirs, what they have in common is loss, primal wound, unabiding anguish. But these authors use a story about what happened to them to illustrate for those like them and others that there is a way to heal through trauma. And I mean, some of these stories are absolutely heartbreaking. And in my experience with reading them, I definitely could see healing. I was healing as I was reading them. And I was also able to gain perspectives from birth mothers by reading birth mother memoirs. And, I'm sure it works vice versa. But, let's face it, whether you're an adoptee or a natural parent, NPE, donor conceived, we all have experienced extreme loss. Jessica Handler is an author who wrote the book Braving the Fire, A Guide to Writing About Grief and Loss. And she says writing well about grief and loss means moving forward as you look back. She says the very act of writing about trauma can create a deeper and more clear perspective on traumatic events. And I certainly found that to be true for myself. Because when we write memoir, we don't just write about what happened, it's making sense of what happened. And that is really where the healing comes in. Now, keep in mind, when you're digging deep like that, this can also be re-traumatizing. And so there's another great book that focuses on writing about trauma by Liz DeBetta, a speaker here at the conference. And a link to her work is included in the resources material of this presentation. Actually, everything that I reference in this presentation is included in the resources section. Now, the lives of those in the constellation, our lives are often influenced and defined by other people. Our destinations were altered, and we were set on paths that we had very little control over. So for me, writing a memoir was about taking back that control. It was about understanding it, about owning it, defining it in my own words and on my own terms. And as we said before, making sense of it. And I want to stop here and talk about the fact that all of our stories are important. When my editor returned my first draft, she asked me, what makes your story special and why should anyone care? And she wasn't trying to be cold. She just knew that the average agent, publisher, or even bookshop customer is going to ask this exact same question before they choose to devote their precious time to reading your story. But when she asked me this question, my immediate answer was, well, I don't know. I got dejected thinking, yeah, who cares? My story is really no more important than anybody else's story. There's tons of adoptee memoirs written out there already. What difference is it going to make? And, I say it makes a difference because it heals you, one, and two, no stories are ever alike. So, where do you begin? Well, you begin by giving yourself permission. You have a right to have an opinion about what happened to you, about the people whose care you were placed into, or the people or circumstances that led to your loss. And I think sometimes the reason people get stalled about writing or put off the idea of wanting to write that memoir that's been burning inside them is that they have yet to give themselves permission to own their story. And I really urge you, if you're just feeling like you're on the fence, to give yourself that permission to set aside worrying about the feelings of other people and allow yourself the opportunity to really find your voice. Because your story is uniquely yours. And you are the only one that can tell your story. You don't need permission to do it. And each of us, like I said, our stories are unique. There are lessons learned. There are obstacles we overcame. There's pain that we endured, and that all of it transformed us in some way. And I guarantee you that there are no two adoptee stories that are alike. There's no two natural mother stories that are alike, and each one is absolutely worth telling. But before we go a little bit further, I think we need to talk about what a memoir isn't. And it isn't an autobiography or a chronological event of everything that ever happened to you in your life. And I'm sure most people here logically know that. And you're probably saying, yeah, I get that. But what happens is when you really do sit down and start to write, that's the direction your stories initially want to go. And they want to go that way because that's the easy way. That's the easy way to come up with your memories. It's the easy way to write their simple stories. But you also have to remind yourself that a memoir is a set collection of stories that tell a very specific story about some aspect of your life. And what sets memoir apart from a simple retelling is a message that others can take away from it. So ultimately, it's a big story composed of little stories relating to one or two major life events and what they taught you. And if you can kind of get that registered, then as you go through the process of figuring out where your story begins and where it ends and what you're going to include, that's going to help you out a lot. Now, of course, I can't say enough about studying the basics. And I mean, these are, I know this is a short list, but the basics: hook, that's what's going to draw your reader in; the arc, your structure, your core desires, and the mechanics of scene and dialogue. And again, don't do what I did, because if you study these things and know the basics first, it's going to save you thousands of words and countless months of editing. Now, I want to focus in here specifically about core desires, because you really need to nail down a handful of core desires. And these core desires are going to move the story forward throughout the book. And for the other things, if you go and sign up for a memoir writing course, read some great books on memoir writing, these things are going to teach you a lot about these 5 things and many others. And we're going to touch on these devices. But first, I want to share a little bit about my memoir and what inspired it and the lessons that I learned along the way. So I'm going to begin with my current pitch for my book, so you have an idea about the book and that I'll be referencing during the talk. And I want to note that this is what I include in my query letter, and it took a lot of trial and error to boil it down into one paragraph. And this is the way it reads. As a black market baby sold along a curb in 1970, I knew one day I'd tell my story. Of the 170,000 infants relinquished that year, 9,000 were illegally brokered on the black market. I was one of them. As a child, I never knew about the shady attorney my parents hired to cheat the system, or that blackmail compelled the $30,000 deal. Taken by unvetted parents and never adopted or appointed a legal guardian, my life underground began. Fear, abuse, neglect, and addiction followed. Redacted is a timely and cautionary account of the lives destroyed when maternal desperation meets need and greed. At 5, I asked for a new family. At 10, I kicked bits of my grandfather's brain off his front stoop. At 12, I used fake papers. At 18, I stood in my birth mother's shoes. By 21, I realized adoption happened to me, not for me. Now, I want to say it took many revisions and lots of trial and error to get my pitch gelled down into that one paragraph. And the reason why is that I didn't start with a roadmap or any kind of even afternoon of considering what is the arc of this story going to be about. And so I think that if you can start by doing that first, you'll wind up with a synopsis like this. And it will go a long way toward helping you stay on track, and it will help you, it will serve as a roadmap for you to follow. Now, I want to begin, I want to explain that I began the book shortly after reuniting with both my birth parents. And once that happened, I was like, I have a lived experience. I finally have something I feel I'm an expert in, and now I can share my story and my experience with other people. So, I knew other adoptees could learn from my journey, but more than anything, I really just needed to get all of this out. I needed to make sense of the past and process all of those big feelings that come when you, go through a life experience like this. So shortly after meeting my birth father, I began working on the book, and my birth father lived out in the Texas Hill Country, and a friend of his who lived nearby, having heard the news of our reunion and my plans for the book, she offered me 2 weeks in this beautiful cabin that was just a short drive from my pop's place to work on my book. And I like to believe that this is akin to the law of attraction. You know, when you set your mind to doing something, things really will show up and help. So if you make your book a true intention, it will happen. But you have to believe in yourself. And no matter what, you have to believe in yourself. If you don't believe in you, no one else is going to believe in you. So start there. Again, if you're feeling like, how could this possibly ever, really happen? Now, when I was, I'm so sorry. Hold on just 1 minute. Now, somebody came home and let the dogs out. Now I accepted 2 weeks off work. I stocked up on groceries, and I wrote from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day for 2 straight weeks, and stories poured out. In the evenings, my birth father would come by and we'd talk for hours on the porch, getting to know each other. And often our discussion would trigger a key memory that I jot down for the book. So if you're thinking about writing a book and you're in reunion, especially in a new one, I say take as many notes as possible, because the conversations and things that you think you're going to remember probably won't. It feels like you could never forget like these major moments, but they do escape you. So especially since trauma and anxiety can impact moving short-term memories into long-term memories, I would definitely recommend taking a lot of notes along the way. Now, at the end of those 2 weeks, I was really proud of those first pages. There was going to be bad. I was really lucky I didn't know how bad they were. And I want to mention this here is that if you're like me, as soon as you get like that first draft, you're going to want to start sharing it with people. You're going to be excited. And I'm going to warn you, don't share your chapters until you have maybe even a second draft, or at least just find one close friend to share them with. But if you start sharing it with too many people, their opinions are going to muddy the waters, and you really need to learn to trust your story. Also, if you've got your best reviewers reading bad drafts too early, by the time you have a really good draft and you want them to read that, they're going to be kind of tired of reading your drafts. So save your best reviewers for last, for sure. Now, my next tip is remember your story may still be evolving, and don't let anything stop you from getting there. Part of why my story took 10 years to write is because shortly after my reunion with my birth father, my relationship with my birth mother fell apart. And then I learned my husband was having an affair, likely in part due to how our union was changing me. So all of this, of course, triggered my abandonment wounds, and I had a 12-month meltdown, and I ended up losing my job. But when I look back, I realized that all of this was also part of my evolving story. And it wasn't necessarily reasons to stop. It was just probably going to wind up in my book, and some of it did. And the parts that didn't, I'm going to shove into the next book. Now, while all of this was going on, my birth father, who was impressed by my determination to write the book, he'd been working on renovating a little house that he had on his property, so I'd have a getaway place to work on the book. But with no husband, home, or job, I decided to go all in and move into this cabin and do nothing but work on the book. So again, suddenly the universe had provided time and space for me to make this a reality. But, there's another but, 2 months later, it burned down, along with my adoptive mom's ashes, my journals, my memoir notes, my family photos, and obviously my car. And I share this to underscore how important it is to save your work in the cloud. And secondly, to show you that you can still get your book written no matter what life throws at you. It might take longer than you wanted, but it is possible. So what did I do from here? I wanted to crawl under a rock, but instead I wrote my way out of it, and I found my entry point in the process. I found my hook. And so where better to start the story than from the day everything from my adopted life burned to ashes on my birth father's property. So I had a story about searching for my birth mother and my identity, begin with me searching for my adoptive mother's urn and my burned fraudulent documents. And so that's where my story began. Now, I didn't know where my story was going to begin when I set out. And this was at least 2 years into me working on the book. And so sometimes, you know, life is going to happen and your book is still evolving. And that's basically my point for sharing this with you. Like I said, I didn't have my hook when I first started my first draft. Now, your hook is just like what it sounds. It's going to hook your reader in. It's going to make them want to read past your first pages. It's going to capture their attention, and it's going to distinguish your story from a ton of ones that are already out there. And again, it might not come to you till your first draft, but if you keep writing, it is going to come to you. So now let's talk a little bit about first drafts. First drafts are supposed to suck. Like, underline that, write it in lipstick on your bathroom mirror, whatever you need to do. Don't forget that your first draft is supposed to suck, because you are exploring your story. You're weighing what stories to include. You're coping with trauma and going deep triggers trauma. And you're learning to show, not to tell. And this involves putting yourself back in certain times and places, which is obviously going to be more trauma. And it's hard work, and there exists no room for perfection. So seriously, this is a time where you don't want to write one page and then spend 2 hours polishing it, because ultimately that page might not even end up in your second draft. So just try not to edit and just keep writing. Now, also, you don't have to know how you feel or what you think about your life or a given story before you start writing it. I mean, ultimately, the insights are going to come as you start writing, because your right brain's going to trigger on that it's just some repressed things are going to start flowing out of you that you didn't even know were in there through the process of writing. Now, all that said, I will tell you, my first draft, I can only compare to vomiting. I mean, at the risk of grossing people out, when I sat down to write my first draft, that is exactly what I did. I spilled my guts all over the place, again and again and again. And it comes in waves. You get through it and you think, oh my God, that was not fun. I'm so glad that's over. And then more memories and more revelations come up that you had no idea were stirring in there. And they tell us not to vomit our trauma all over people, you know, to be careful about oversharing. But it's here during your first draft, you need to permit yourself to do just that. I mean, this is about purging your past. And just like we get physically sick when we put something in our bodies that isn't good for us, unresolved trauma makes us sick too. And you can really write your way through the trauma, and it can be a form of healing. So now, as you're purging onto the page, what for sure is going to happen is you're going to start thinking about Aunt Evelyn reading this, or your mom, or your sister, and you'll start wanting to soften up the truth. And in my opinion, there comes a time when we must stop taking care of the feelings of other people and start looking after our own. And when we show up authentically in the world, that means we open up to the possibility of building authentic relationships with friends and family. And readers love authenticity, and they will know when you're holding out on them. So if you're trying to make some person in your family look nicer than they were, or skim over a really bad situation, I'd say either leave it out or get real and be real truthful with it, because if you just sort of lightly touch on it, it's going to make the memoir fall flat. Now, at the same time, sharing your story may open up conversations that lead to closer bonds with your family. People are always thinking, oh, I'm so afraid I'm going to upset somebody. But for me, the people I worried most about reading my book were the very ones who never even asked to see it in the first place. And others who did read it had nice and kind things to say about it, and they wanted to learn more. And we ended up having some really nice conversations. I mean, I admit it's a toss-up, but I say worry more about the value that you're going to get out of writing your story, and less about like what happens if your aunt gets her feelings hurt. especially when you're writing your first draft. You can always take it out. But again, that's just part of like the processing that you probably need to do. So it's right about here also when you might read back over what you wrote and think your keyboard has turned on you. It might even be growling at you. Good Lord, that's horrible. Stop abusing me, or something like that. And you'll want to give up. And here's where you remind yourself that your first draft is for your eyes only, and it is supposed to suck. Actually, if you think your first draft is super good, then you probably have a bigger problem. You probably need to get real and take a step back and share it with someone and ask for an impartial opinion for some honest feedback. Now, once all that stuff that wanted to come out and up is in front of you and you have your final draft, it's time to weed out the crap and start polishing it, right? Well, have you ever tried to polish vomit? Right? I have. And so off I went with my binder of vomit to my first writing retreat in Costa Rica. And, I was pretty sure I had a story, but I knew in my gut that, this is rambling and disjointed and I need some help, right? So I needed some impartial feedback. And I encourage you to find a community of writers and join them, because these are the only people that are going to be able to give you honest, informed feedback. Your best friend, your boyfriend, your kind neighbor, your children, your husband, they are not going to give you the kind of feedback that you need, even if they're telling you that they're being impartial. They just can't. First of all, they're not studying the craft of writing, and that's huge. And I've included a list of adoptee writing groups and other memoir writing groups in the resource sections of this presentation as well. Now, when I got to Costa Rica, I learned that the instructor was an adoptive mom, and her name was Julie, and she published an adoption-themed young adult novel. She had an MFA, she had years of experience as an editor, and she published several books. And it was very important too that, she was familiar with my subject matter. She lived in Canada when she was adopting, and I learned through her that Canada does a really good job educating parents about adoption trauma. So I trusted her to read my memoir with, being informed about adoption. And I did feel like the universe brought her to me also. And by the end of the retreat, she agreed to take on editing my book. And I encourage you to hire an editor who can provide developmental and structural editing when you're ready. And this is just like what it sounds. It's a review of the structure of your story, the order of your scenes. And a good editor is going to hold you accountable. She's going to point out when you've gone off track. She's going to explain, that you've skipped over a detail, or you've contradicted yourself, or you've cut yourself short. Also, if you do hire an editor, you need to set your ego aside and listen to their advice and take it and learn from it and apply it, and you will see your writing improved. An example of how Julie helped me in a very significant part of my book was when I got my notes back from my first draft. She picked out a particularly pivotal scene in the climax of my book and wrote, "You've only given this 2 paragraphs. It needs its own entire chapter." Now, the scene that she was referring to was the moment when I discover my parents don't know my actual birthday, and that they never received my birth certificate, and that they had been blackmailed by this attorney. And I literally only gave this 2 paragraphs. So it's wonderful that my editor was an adoptive mom, because she immediately zeroed in on the fact that this is a super key moment in the life of an adoptee. And of course, this is also part of the apex of my story. And I completely skipped around it. Why? Because I didn't emotionally allow myself to process the pain that lived in that event. Like, my psyche just didn't want to go there. So of course I took note, I sat down to write the chapter, and I sobbed as the words came out. And I returned to that room and the tension in it and the aftermath of it. And that's what it really takes to write a good scene. It's really going back into that sometimes very difficult moment and, being there. And I really had a lot of grieving to do around that memory, and I did grieve it. And that was part of my healing process, as many portions of the book led me to places like that. So like I said, I just can't say enough great things about why you need to have an editor. Here's a short list of the things that she taught me that I'd like to share with you. One, you, the writer, you must understand your protagonists. This is the person in the story, which is that version of you. You need to understand her core desires, conscious and subconscious. So what does your protagonist think she wants, and what does she actually want? And the narrator version of you, that's the one telling the story, they need to make sure that your reader understands both of these things as well. So an example of this is when I first started writing the book, I would have said, I was writing a book about finding my birth mother. But the me today will tell you, I wrote a book about solving the mystery surrounding the black market events that stole my identity and threatened my ability to prove my citizenship. So that second one sounds way more interesting than the first one, right? You meet somebody on a bus and they ask, oh, what's your story about? And the second one for sure is going to make some ears pop up. So show, don't tell, use scenes and dialogue whenever possible. She also taught me that you don't want your reader to feel like they're reading your diary entry. They need to feel like they're reading a novel. And this will inform which stories you choose to include as well. You'll want to ask, like, can I show this in a scene? Also, like we discussed, find your hook. Your pages have to get people to care about you and your story. To do that, you can't just say what happened. You have to explain how whatever happened impacted you, how it made you feel, what you learned from it, what you did not learn from it. And this is hard because we often have memories that we're incredibly connected to, but we haven't done the work to figure out what they mean to us. And so, you know, you really do need to do that reflection. And you want to watch for emotional blocks. You want to be vulnerable and you want to admit your faults. This is also really important. You want to employ a 3-act story structure, which has a beginning and a middle and an end. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So now let's look at some common mistakes that we first-time memoir writers like to make. Lack of story structure. Now, this is a failure to apply a coherent narrative. It's when your book might read more like a collection of short stories because you've got to take time to create that arc, that how did I get, where did I come from and how did I get there and what happened along the way, which we're going to dive into again in just a little bit. Overemphasis on detail. So that's including excessive minutia that doesn't serve the story or the, you know, very well. It's like this. It's like you tell in the story, you say grandpa always came with chocolates in his pocket. You know, that tells us a lot about grandpa. He's a nice grandpa. He likes chocolate. He's friendly. But if you go into, and one time he came to our house and the chocolates had all melted in his pocket and they were covered, he had keys in his pocket that were covered with chocolate. Like that's a sentimental story that means something to you, but probably doesn't move the story forward. The only time something like that would move the story forward is if grandpa needed to put the keys in the car engine to turn it on because you broke your leg and he was trying to get you to the hospital. Okay, then that matters, right? So you have to rein in the sentimental stories and only provide enough detail to really to not weigh your story down. Now, also sometimes we lack thematic focus. And we're going to look at how you find your theme or your set of central themes in just a second. But you really do need to identify your theme because that's going to help keep your narrative on track. Telling and not showing is another one. You don't want your book to read like it's a diary entry. You want vivid scenes, dialogue, sensory detail. You really want the reader to feel like they're in the room with you. You need to learn to write a good scene, and a good writing teacher course or even a book is really going to help you learn how to do this well. Another is lack of self-awareness, and this is a big one, and I think it's a frequent reason a lot of people put down memoir, like they just like, oh, I can't read that, I can't get into that. And that's when the writer fails to engage in self-reflection or to examine their own faults. They let their biases come in, and the memoir can seem really one-dimensional. So be careful about making yourself look like a complete victim where everything is one-sided. It's important to show all the sides and let the reader come to their own conclusion. Also, try not to tell your reader how they're supposed to feel about something. Like, show them what happened and let them come to their own conclusions, and trust that they'll probably come to the same conclusions that you will. Also, be vulnerable. Don't be afraid to show the not so great parts of yourself. Humility and contrition can go a long way with your readers. Don't forget to remember your reader's perspective. And this can be as simple as just like, if you're from the South, remember that not everybody's from the South. So if you say it's May, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to know it's 90 degrees outside, that sort of thing. Poor pacing. This was sort of an example of when I skipped over that very important scene. Pacing, some of your sections can drag on and some of them can be too short. And you really need to make sure that as you write your different parts of your book, that you're balancing the movement of the story. Now, ethical concerns, that's a hornet's nest of things. I urge you to go online and research this. You want to consider the privacy of other people mentioned in your memoir, and you're going to find a lot of great resources online, and this is probably covered in every book out there about all the things that you have to think about when you're talking about other people. I mean, it can be done, but there's a fine line about what's right and what's wrong and how to do this, and it's probably too much to get into today, but just do pay attention to ethical concerns and take time to research that when you're writing a book. Now, the biggie for me, probably because I'm a perfectionist, is skipping revision. Do not underestimate the importance of revising and peer review. If you don't do it, your book's going to feel unpolished. It's going to feel unprofessional and unfinished. And this is part of the reason that a lot of the memoir that is out there in the self-published world has a bad reputation, because many authors, not all of them, but some, really don't do this part, and it reflects bad on all the self-published books that are out there. So do your best to hire an editor and make sure that you revise your work. Now, where do you go from there, right? When you're sitting down with your page, where do you start? So you start with your lessons learned. What have you learned from your experiences? What sorts of themes can point you toward personal growth, the wisdom, the transformations that you've been through? And these themes include things like, I skipped one, identity and belonging, loss and reunion, family dynamics, cultural displacement, search for truth, love and attachment, nature versus nurture, resilience and growth. And so those are all really strong themes. And once you have your themes in mind, then you can start thinking about your story arc and how you're going to tell your story. And we've all heard the sayings, the beginning of the end, or start with the end in mind. And we know stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But what I didn't know when I started out is that each part has three parts. So the beginning has a beginning, a middle, and an end, as does the middle has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end does as well. And each of these middles is a mini climax. The one in the middle is your major climax, but when you structure each part to have their own little arcs, what that does is it creates a forward page turning momentum. And that structure is really, when you start finding your memories and trying to figure out how you're going to tell them, you're going to follow this wave-like structure, and it's going to help you know where to put certain stories on your clothesline. And so let's look at the clothesline and look at brainstorming memories right now. Now, Susan spoke about this morning, and I know everybody had an activity doing something like this, and that's brainstorming important memories from your life. And this process will help you find your through line of your book. And a through line is like a clothesline that you hang your memories on, and it's tied to your themes that you've determined, and it helps compel your story forward and give it momentum. So you can use emails and blogs, old letters, photos, journal entries to inspire you. These are all great memories, great vehicles to jog your memory. You can look at big events, small events, anything from the day you learned to tie your shoes to the day you were married, birthdays, tragedies, loss, death, disappointment, life-altering events, anything that you feel is pertinent to the story that you want to tell. So you just let them fly out, and you don't need them to be in any order, just the more the better. And some people call this brainstorming your turning point list. And then once you have this list, you're going to cherry pick the ones that you know that you have to have in your story. And you'll look at each one and think about how old you were and what year it was and who you were with and why you were there. And this will help you take stock of each one and decide which ones to keep. So as you prioritize them into the ones you know your story just can't live without, the obvious ones are just going to jump right out at you. So the day I dropped the "Are you my mom" letter in the mailbox, the day I learned Uncle Larry was my dad, the day I left the hospital without my child, the moment I found out I was adopted. And so these are the obvious ones you're going to keep. But then you have to look at all the other ones and figure out, okay, which one of these, I can't keep them all. So how do I sort through those? And some of these will be purely sentimental. Some will be repetitive. Some are going to offer the same or a similar lesson or takeaway. And so you'll want to weed through them and sort of make them do battle against each other. So let's look at some that I included in my book to give you examples of how I did this. So I'll start with this: the day Daddy wrecked the car due to falling asleep from working so hard. I put this on my list and thought, well, this is a good example of what a strong work ethic he had and how hard he worked. But then I thought, well, I wasn't even there that day he wrecked the car. That was just a story I heard, not one I witnessed. And there's also plenty of other stories that I'm already got in my timeline that do a better job of showing my father's work ethic. So I scratched that one. The day I asked my mother to let a better mommy adopt me. Now, for sure, that shows my mindset about around adoption as a child. It shows the conflicts that I was having. And so definitely going to keep that one. Drive with Dad and stop to pick cotton on the side of the highway as I, at 6 years old, got out of the car alone due to his trouble walking. So that sounds like a good story, but I'd already written a story about my dad trying to push the car home in a rainstorm with me, 5 years old, behind the steering wheel, trying to steer it because it had broken down. And in that story, the danger and the stakes are higher. It still does a really good job of illustrating the limitations of his disability. And I can't have both because you don't want to repeat the stories that sort of teach the same lesson. So at this point, I recognized that one was more sentimental. And I also realized that I'm going to write a story about my birth father and I about that reunion. And my father and I were picking cotton not too far from where my birth father lived. So I thought, well, that's a story about fathers. That'll go really well in the next book. So sometimes when you have to part with a scene that you really love, just remind yourself you're not throwing it in the trash. You're just setting it over here on a shelf and you're going to use it at another time. Now, another one was being told my parents didn't know my birthday or have my birth certificate. We talked about that. That's my whole story would fall apart if I didn't keep that one in the book. So definitely kept that one. Time my grandmother Minnie taught me to make fudge. Easy peasy, totally sentimental. It does nothing to move my story forward. I'm not going to keep that. So this is why you need to, this is a good way of weeding through your memories and sort of having a contest to see which ones are going to stay in there and which ones aren't. So once you've done that, you're going to choose your keepers for your clothesline, and you want to remove, like I said, any redundant stories. Another example would be, for instance, you only need one scene of your mom screaming and maybe two scenes of your mom screaming and throwing things to show that she has anger management issues. Any more after that, it's going to become tiresome and redundant. And your readers will find themselves thinking, okay, I get it. She's a nasty woman. So you want to trust that your readers will get it without you repeating things. And remember, you don't have to write, my mom was an angry woman. It's not needed if you've done a good job showing her hurl a plate across the room. So once you have your keepers, you now need to determine in what order your memories are going to be hung. And it's harder than it sounds, but luckily we have a story arc in the hero's journey to help us with that. So let's look at the hero's journey real fast. Now, the hero's journey is a narrative framework that was popularized by Joseph Campbell in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And it's often divided into three main acts. And the arc of the hero's journey looks a little bit like this. And again, when you think about your arc and your hero's journey, you want to think, who was I when the story began? What happened along the way that changed me and brought me to who I am now? So we've got our protagonist, and we're starting with an inciting incident. This is an event or realization that triggers the memoir's main quest or theme, and it pushes the author into a journey of discovery or change. Then we've got rising action. This is a series of events that challenge and build tension and complexity in the story. This is where your protagonist is going to interact with key people. They're going to struggle with internal dilemmas. Gee, I want to search, but should I not search? That sort of thing, and facing external obstacles. Then you've got the climax. Obviously, this is where your memoir is going to find its most significant insight. Your protagonist is going to have some realizations and become transformed in some way. And then the following action is basically what unfolds from the climax and leads to the resolution. And oftentimes this is like reconciling with other people, accepting new realities, or arriving at some newfound understanding about other people or about self. And ultimately in the resolution, loose ends are tied up and the author reflects on the journey and its impact. Now, if we take a different look at the hero's journey, and I really like this diagram because you can kind of see the full circle of it. The journey is divided into three main acts: departure, initiation, and return. So I think everybody can see the parallels here and why this is a great form for writers in the constellation to follow as you approach memoir, because we're going from the familiar right here, get my pointer out. We're going from the familiar to being called on a quest to find our truth or our person. And usually we meet some mentor. For me, it was somebody in AKA that encourages us that it is possible if we go on our journey. And then we embark through this new frontier and we find other people like us along the way. And then we face a lot of trials and tribulations, and we are searching for our answers, and we're obviously meeting people and bureaucracies that want to deny us our answers. And so that's like the ordeal and facing the dragon, right? And hopefully we do go on to get our answers. But if we don't get our answers, we at least get the reward of knowing we've done everything we could and we've learned some amazing insights about ourselves and about others and knowledge that we didn't have before along the way. And ultimately, we take that back home with us and we return to our communities with it. So this for me is really a wonderful way when you think about your story on where do my personal life stories fall into this structure or this framework. Now, if you want to dig deeper into departure, I'm not sure I have a lot of time left to do that, but departure for adoptees, this is like the before and during coming out of the fog. For natural parents, this would be connecting to events that occurred before placement. In the departure, we leave the ordinary world, we're called to action. Oftentimes we're hesitant or we're reluctant to answer that call. We find a mentor who gives us guidance and wisdom, and we cross the threshold and enter into an unfamiliar world. And then in initiation for adoptees, this is kin to beginning the active search for ourself, our truth, our answers, and our identity. For natural parents, this may look like the experience of the relinquishment process. And this is where we're challenged by friends and foes. We are preparing for a huge ordeal. We're confronting our greatest fears, and the outcome is basically, we've gone through something valuable and we've attained some wisdom, or we've met our goal. And then in the return for adoptees, this is often coping with whatever we found or we did not find, and possibly wanting to help other adoptees. And for natural parents, this may look like trying to find one's path forward after separation, and possibly a desire to educate potential birth mothers about their experience. So this is the road back, back to the ordinary world, returning home transformed to some way and sharing what we've learned with our community. So I apologize for only referencing adoptees and natural parents. I realize there are many other individuals in the constellation, NPs and donor conceived. So please forgive me for that. But I do believe that this circle, it's a universal storyline, so it can apply to almost any experience within the constellation. Now, last, I'm going to be wrapping up with how to get feedback on your drafts and your beta readers. And you want to choose impartial people who know your subject matter. You want to ask for feedback on 3 chapters. Now, here's the trick. Give your reader your whole book, your whole draft, but ask for feedback on 3 chapters. This way they don't feel like they're committing to having to read a whole book, especially if they don't enjoy the book. But if they do read the whole book, then that's a good sign for you that your story is compelling and it carried their interest. And so, good, yay for you. You also want to ask for honest feedback on places where they lost interest, or they felt confused, or they became bored. And that will give you some insight on how you're doing with pacing and maybe how you've arranged your stories in your narrative. You also want to ask them to note what they liked, the questions that came to mind while they were reading it, and give them a window for their feedback. So the last thing you want to do is be like, have you read it yet? Have you read it yet? You want to give it to them. And when the time comes, say, okay, we said I needed it back by the end of this month. And then at the end of the month, say, hey, how's it going? And then if they say, oh, I'm almost done, great. But I wouldn't pressure anybody after that. I've been on both ends of this, and neither one are very comfortable. Don't give it to too many people at once, because when you get a lot of revisions back or a lot of feedback back, it's a little hard to incorporate it all. But at the same time, pay attention when several people give you the same feedback. I mean, that's huge, because obviously this is not just one person's opinion, it's multiple people's opinion. And again, like I said earlier, you want to save your best readers for your final draft. I found beta readers that included both a natural mother, and my editor was an adoptive mother. So I felt like I was really covering my basis. And once I had feedback back from those 2, my fears about how it was going to be received by these other audiences were very much tamed. I didn't always take their advice, but I took it about 90% of the time. And over the course of my project, which I've pretty much already said, I took memoir writing classes. I read numerous books on memoir writing. I read other people's memoir. And I attended those writing retreats. And through all of that, I've grown as a writer, and I've developed some really seriously thick skin, and my writing has improved for it. Now, in wrapping up, it's pretty straightforward. Study the form, read best-selling memoir, always be truthful with what you write your heart out, hire and trust a great editor, revise and revise, and own your story. And, you know, the most important is just start writing. Now, this is basically where the presentation ends, but I want to show you, give you a little tour of what's in the resources section that will be available online. So I've added several pages of writing prompts. I think you've got 3 slides of writing prompts that you can work with. I've got numerous links on books on writing memoir. I've got links for the memoirs that I love, the ones that are just plain great, not about adoption, but also ones that are related to adoption. And I mean, there's only 4, but Lord, you know, there's a load out there. Adoptee and memoir writing groups. These are the groups where you can find your impartial feedback and who will help you hone your craft. And also I've included books on writing to heal trauma, podcast interviews on writing to heal trauma, podcasts on memoir writing. And all of these resources are not just available in the slide deck that's on the website here for the conference, but they're also available on my website under the resources section. And if you want to get to the resources section, you can just take you can use this QR code to take you directly there.